Hello, I'm Anne from Lolli and Grace, and welcome to the tutorial for my beginner rose pattern. You can purchase this PDF pattern in my Etsy shop, as well as kits when I can keep them in stock, which I try to do as much as I can. I'd also like to invite you to join me over on Instagram. You know, there's a lot of fun stuff happening there, including giveaways, discussions of embroidery tips and techniques, and notifications of all my latest pattern and kit releases. So I call this design the beginner rose because it's perfect for new stitchers. But you know, it's also great for more experienced stitchers as well, who would like a fun, fast project to stitch up. So each version of the rose uses a very simple stitch. The first one is the most basic. It works up really fast, but it's still very pretty. The second one right here, it looks complicated, but it's really just one stitch over and over. But I really love the way this one turned out with its it's got lots of texture and its blocks of color, big bright blocks of fun color. I love that one. The third one is also really easy. It's the same stitch over and over, but it has a real wow factor because it stitches up quickly, but I love this one too because it was quick, but really had a nice impact, I think. So let's get started. The first thing we need to talk about is the supplies you will need. And the great thing about embroidery is that it does not require a huge expense for supplies. These are not expensive supplies and you don't need a whole lot of them, but there are a few basic things you'll need, and they are. I will quickly go through them and then I'll talk a little bit more in depth about each one. You will need a hoop. I use these very inexpensive wooden ones available at most craft stores. There's bamboo, there's some plastic ones, but these are the ones I use the most often. You will need fabric. You'll need embroidery thread, all different kinds of thread basically, but the most common one are the DMC 6-stranded embroidery floss or thread. I use those two terms interchangeably, but it's got 6 strands, beautiful cotton with a nice sheen to it. You will need needles, little scissors to snip off the ends of your thread, and those are the basic things you'll need. You will also need a pattern to transfer your pattern to your fabric, and some sort of marking pen to do that transfer. In one of the next segments, we're going to talk about how to transfer your pattern to your fabric. But for now, let's talk a little bit more in depth about these supplies. Let's talk about fabric. My absolute favorite fabric to stitch on is 100% cotton. This is a nice high quality quilting cotton. This one is from Kona, K-O-N-A, and there's also one from Moda. They both have a beautiful range of nice high quality solid colors, beautiful nice texture, nice and smooth, not a cheap fabric. I promise you, don't be fooled and think, well, this is my first project, I'm just going to use some little cheap fabric because I don't want to spend a lot. It's not worth it. It's horrible to stitch on. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't perform well. This fabric is not very expensive. For a hoop this size, this is a 5-inch or 6-inch. It really only takes about a quarter of a yard, and that's just a couple of dollars of fabric. So don't cheat yourself. Get a nice high quality quilting cotton to start out with. The embroidery thread that we talked about, again, DMC, Anchor makes one. There's other hand-dyed threads. There's pearl cotton, but the most common is this 6-stranded DMC embroidery thread. Beautiful colors, lots of colors. You can see when you pull it out, it's made up of multiple strands. And again, a little bit later, I will show you how to separate those strands correctly, depending on how many you need for each pattern. The needles that I like, you can buy something just called an embroidery needle. The difference in an embroidery needle and, say, for instance, a sewing needle is that a sewing needle has a sharp tip and a little tiny hole up here. An embroidery needle, or any kind of needle that is going to be good for embroidery, is going to have a sharp tip and a larger hole right here because you are trying to fit a thicker multiple strands, anywhere from maybe one, but 2, 3, 4 strands, sometimes maybe even 6 strands of this embroidery thread through that hole. So you need this to be a little bit larger. My all-time favorite needle is called a chenille needle. The size I like is a number 24. To me, it just feels good in my hand. It's a nice size. It's not too big, not too small, and I can easily thread any number of strands that I like through that hole. Embroidery scissors, you can use, these are really super high quality, little tiny embroidery snips. You can use these, which are less expensive, from Fiskars, they're small. You can use big scissors too. I just kind of prefer to use a slightly smaller size because I'm working on little small threads. The type of marking pen that I like for transferring, there's several different things I use, but one of the most basic is an air-soluble or water-soluble marking pen. This particular one has water-soluble ink on this end and air-soluble on this side. What that means is that this side is going to just disappear on its own. Just leave it out in the air and it goes away. This side you have to rinse off. My personal preference is not to have to rinse my pieces after I stitch them. It's another step, and some threads that you sometimes use are not color fast, so if you do rinse them, the colors will run. On a white fabric, you can imagine like this, it would look awful if the colors ran. So I very often will use just the air-soluble disappearing ink. It's a purple ink, and that's pretty universal, that blue is water-soluble, purple is air-soluble. The only thing about this is, you may transfer your pattern on, and if you go away, come back the next day, it might have faded or maybe even gone away. If you live in a very humid area, it goes away faster. Drier areas, not quite so fast. So you might want to consider the water soluble. I think you'll figure out which one works best for you. So that's one option. Another thing that I use for every single time that I thread a needle is a needle threader. This is the very inexpensive version. You can find them a lot of places. It's a little wire, and I'll show you a little bit later exactly how to use a needle threader. But you just put your thread through there, insert the needle threader in through the hole of the needle, put your thread through this hole, and then pull the thread back through. So that's an inexpensive version. Sometimes these tend to not last very long because this little wire right here is pretty fragile. You can get a more expensive, a little bit more substantial one. I got this at a quilt store. This has a flattened wire that's a little bit stronger, but again, it's flat, so it goes through the hole of the needle and allows you to pull any number of strands through. So that's a needle threader. The other thing that you might perhaps need, and I definitely recommend this, is what's called cotton twill tape. And the way that I use this to help me is to wrap the inner hoop of the two hoops, the inner and outer hoops. I wrap the inner hoop so that it squeezes, so that when I stretch my fabric in the hoop, it stays very tight. I like my fabric crazy, crazy tight. It's much easier to stitch on, you're more accurate, it doesn't pucker. Everything about it is better if your fabric will stay tight the whole time you're stitching. So next up, let me show you how to use cotton twill tape to wrap the inner hoop. As I mentioned before, wrapping the inner hoop of your two hoops will help you keep your fabric tight as you're stitching. And it's really simple to do. You will need a hot glue gun. You can also sew it, but honestly, a hot glue gun is really going to be a little bit easier. So this is 1-inch cotton twill tape. You can cut the end off at an angle, pretty sharp angle like that. And then start on the inside, put a little bit of hot glue. Watch out, don't burn your fingers. And glue the end of that twill tape down just like that. So once that's glued down, then you're going to start wrapping the twill tape around the hoop like this at an angle, and you want the edges of the twill tape to sit side by side. See how that's a smooth, you can't even see where they are. You do not want to wrap it so that the edges overlap, because that makes a bump every time they overlap, and you want it to be smooth all the way around. So take a little bit of time, pull it tightly, find that right angle, that correct angle, so that the sides are butted up next to each other all the way around. Keep wrapping it. You don't have to glue it again. I only glue it at the beginning and the end. Keep wrapping all the way around, and it's a little bit easier when the beginning is glued down tightly. Keep wrapping till you're finished. When you come to the end, snip it off at an angle again and glue it on the inside. You don't want to glue it on the outside for the same reason. It'll leave a bump right there. And what you're aiming for is a tight fit between the inner and outer hoops. So you can see on this one, oh, not that one, this one, this is what I'm working on. You can see the inside hoop is wrapped with the twill tape, and it allows me to keep this fabric really, really tight so that when I pull it and stretch it and tighten this screw, the cushioning of the inner hoop allows the inner and outer hoop to squeeze the fabric more tightly than if you only used a hoop that that was just wood up against wood. So that's how to wrap the inner hoop of your embroidery hoop with twill tape. Now that you have the inner hoop wrapped with twill tape, it's time to put some fabric in the hoop. So what I've done is I've cut a square of my nice quality quilting cotton. I will lay the inner hoop down, center this on here. And if you're not working with a big square, if you're working with just a big piece of fabric, I always just make sure I leave myself about 1.5 inches at least on each side, maybe 2 inches. So place it under there. I think you can see that. Unscrew your hoop. Put that outer hoop on top. I put it just a little ways down, and then I begin to tighten. Now, here's the part that takes a little bit of patience. I keep pushing that hoop down, and now I'm going to keep tightening the screw and pulling the fabric. Now, I try to pull the fabric evenly as I go around. I don't yank this way and this way and this way, and I try to pull evenly from both sides. So I'm going to pull this way. I'm going to work my way down. It's a little bit hard, as normally I rest it against the side of the table. I know it's kind of bouncing around a little bit. And then I'm going to flip it the other direction, and I'm pulling the fabric out like that. It's getting tighter, but I want it even more tight than that, so I'm going to keep tightening that screw. Some people even use a pair of pliers. And I'm going to keep pulling and pulling, tugging on it. I had a little wrinkle, so I'm going to make sure I pull that out. You'd be surprised, the longer you pull, you might think it's as tight as you can get it, but if you pull a little bit more, it'll go even tighter. Now, sometimes the outer hoop will kind of go back up. I keep pushing it back down, making sure that the screw has not come untightened. Sometimes I will go around like this a little bit. I know I said I didn't really do that earlier, but sometimes you can. I don't want the fabric to be skewed out of alignment. I kind of like it to make sure I keep it, the weave of the fabric so it's not all wonky and diagonal. Keep pulling till it is absolutely as tight as you think it can be, and then pull it a little bit more. And there's a reason for that. We call it being drum tight, and there's a reason. It's not just being picky. When you are stitching, if you're doing a lot of stitching all in one direction, you can get puckers in your fabric. In other words, the fabric kind of puckers up like that in between stitches, and you just cannot ever get that out. I am much more accurate when I feel like the fabric is not shifting on me as I'm putting the needle through each time. That needle gives it a nice little pop when it's really tight. So if you'll just learn to stitch on really super, super tight fabric, you will just be happier in the long run. And this is why having that wrapped inner hoop is so important, because it helps the inner and outer hoops squeeze the fabric more tightly as you are stitching. Without it, sometimes as you're stitching, especially this seems to be the worst spot right up here, that fabric will go like that and you'll get a wrinkle in it. If it's the inner hoop is not wrapped, that happens all the time, and you'll constantly be pulling your fabric back out tight again. Once I started working on wrapped hoops, I have to do that either not at all or much less of the time now, and I like it much better. So now I think that's about as tight as I can get it. Make sure that screw is tight. The last thing I like to do is I use a pair of pinking shears. These are scallops, but the most common kind is a zigzag. And I trim my fabric all the way around the edge. Don't trim it off too much. I like to leave about 1.5 inches or so. The reason I use pinking shears is that reduces the fraying on the edge here. You can just cut it with regular scissors, that's fine. If you don't have pinking shears, it's not a big deal. But the reason I I trim it, is because, see this corner that's longer? You're gonna spend a lot of time going from front to back as you stitch. And when you've got a flap of fabric like this, it keeps getting in your way. I have caught it as I'm stitching, and I've caught it on the back side, and that's a nightmare. So once I started stitching with my fabric trimmed all the way around the edge, I really just don't ever have that problem anymore. And the fabric stays out of my way, and I can stitch happily without constantly worrying about those corners of fabric getting in my way and getting caught and bothering me as I'm stitching. So that is how to tightly stretch fabric in your hoop. All right, the next step is to transfer the pattern onto your stretched fabric. All right, transferring your pattern to your stretched fabric is probably the most common question that I get. And it can be a little perplexing sometimes, depending on the color of your fabric and the intricacy of your pattern. But this is the method that I use probably 97% of the time. And it's very simple. I've printed out my pattern. All of my patterns have the circle drawn, a dashed line around them, so you'll know where to cut. So cut it out on the dotted line, and that's made so that it will fit up in the back of your hoop like that. Let me get that out of there. Didn't put it in the right place. Hang on. Come out of there. Fits very tightly. And then this is where we're going to use our marking pen. In this instance, I'm going to use the air soluble, the purple ink, because like I said, I don't really love to rinse my hoops after I stitch them. And this is a relatively simple pattern. If I use the air soluble and I trace it on and I come back the next day and it's starting to fade, I just quickly go over the lines. If I was doing a pattern that was a larger hoop that had tons of lines and I knew it was going to take me a while to do it, I would consider using the one that's water soluble, that stays permanent until you rinse it out with water. The other option that you can use is what's called a Frixion erasable. I use this a lot. It's like a ballpoint pen, comes in different colors. This is the fine 0.07, and you can mark on your fabric, and it erases with heat, which for stitching purposes, I use a hairdryer blowing on hot air, and the lines do go away. You have to be a little careful with this, because on some fabrics, particularly colored fabrics, it can leave kind of a ghost line. So when I'm stitching it, I try to be very when I'm stitching using that Frixion pen and I'm tracing my design, I'm very careful to make sure I'm very precise and I'm not just like scribbling random things, because sometimes those lines are not 100% erasable. But anyway, let's get back to using this one. I've cut out my pattern, stretched my fabric, cut out my pattern. I figure out what the top of my pattern is. I happen to have it marked here because I like to work with it right side up under the screw of the hoop. And so I flip it over and I determine that's the top right there, and that's the screw. All right, so that's lined up correctly, and I'm going to put it on the back side of the hoop. And now I will use just regular Scotch tape, you know, cellophane tape, whatever they call it now, invisible tape, I think is what they call it. And I'm just going to tape in 3 spots, make sure it's secure on the sides there, just to hold it in place. And now what you can do, you can hold this up, you can pretty much, on this white fabric, you can pretty much just see it. If you press on the back, I'm pressing my fingers up against it. See, when it's not pressed, you can't see it as well. And I press my fingers, you can see that design. So you really don't even have to put a bright light behind this because it's a white fabric. So if I just press up and start tracing this design onto the fabric, and you can see if you're working on a pattern that's not quite so easy to see or has smaller, more intricate lines, or maybe a fabric that's a darker shade, you can hold this up like this to a bright window, a sunny window. I just take my work lamp and bring it down. I'll show you, it's a little bit, don't want to blind you here, but let me turn my work lamp on and I'll show you what I'm talking about. So here's my work lamp, and I just face it towards me like this, and I think you can see, if you hold, see how you can see the pattern really well that way. That work, even if this is like a dark green fabric, anything other than perhaps, well, I've even done it with navy fabrics, but you can see if you push with your fingers and trace the design on. The reason I like to trace my design onto my already stretched fabric is because that way I know the design is exactly the way I intended it to look. In other words, if I were to take a piece of fabric not stretched in the hoop like this, if this was my fabric and I just laid it onto my pattern like this and traced it, and then took this fabric and stretched it in a hoop, the pattern itself might get stretched out of place. And I'm picky about the way my patterns, I want them to be very precise when I'm tracing them. So this way the fabric is already stretched, it's in place, it's not going anywhere, and the pattern is very accurate. So that's how to transfer a pattern onto your stretched fabric. So obviously, since we are stitching with a needle and thread, you're going to be threading a lot of needles, right? And there's a little bit of an art to this. It's really simple, but here's a few tips that will help. So as I mentioned, this is a 6-stranded embroidery floss cotton. These skeins, each of these is called a skein. These skeins of DMC thread, you always want to pull the thread from the end that has the number. You should easily find a little, an end that comes out. And if you just pull it gently, it should just flow right out of that skein of thread. Now, how long to cut this length of thread? Some people prefer to cut them a little bit shorter. I like them a little bit longer. It depends on the threads, how long, what type of thread I'm using, how long I cut it. But I'd say if you're just starting out, cut it about 30 to 36 inches should be fine. So I'm going to cut that. Here's where my little scissors come in. All right, so now almost all of my patterns I rarely use the whole 6 strands of embroidery floss. I separate the strands, and sometimes I'll use 3 strands. A lot of the times I'll use 4. 3 and 4 strands are my most commonly number of strands used. Sometimes I use 2. But somehow you have to separate these strands, and you don't just choose 3 and rip it apart. I used to do it that way, and it was very frustrating because the threads twist back on themselves, and then they all knot up, and then you're frustrated, and then the threads themselves don't lay down very well as you're stitching. So the correct way to separate strands is called stripping. That sounds a little violent, but it's not, I promise. So let's say we're going to use 3 strands. So let me see if I will see if I can get a little closer so you can see this better. So I'm going to very gently tease out 1 strand of thread. Hopefully you can see that. Okay, you see 1 strand of thread? All right, I'm going to hold it with this hand, sort of gently, pinch it between, and I'm just going to pull that strand out. And as I pull, you can see the other threads are kind of spiraling up in my hand. And you might be panicking thinking, oh my God, you're gonna have a massive knot. But you really don't. If you just keep pulling, here's my 1 thread, here are the rest, and then I'm going to very gently just run my fingers along the rest of the remaining 5, and there you go. See, it's not in a knot at all. And I will take my 1 strand and lay it on my table like that with the end where I can see it. And then I'm going to do that again. I'm going to tease out 1 strand. And you really don't have to go that slowly. I actually zip them out pretty fast, really. So you can see just like that. I lay that 1 strand down, lining up the end with the first one that I pulled out. Just like that. And I run my hands back down the remaining 4 now, and they've straightened out. And I will keep doing that. I said I needed 3 strands, so 1 more time. Zip that out. I can put that aside and I'll line these up, line the ends up, hold them down, and now I will take all 3 of these strands and generally make sure those ends are lined up, and now I run my fingers down all 3 of these to get them all lined up like that. And now there's my 3 strands. The beauty of this is it's quick. You might be thinking this is so tedious, it's gonna take me forever to get all these strands. It's really not. You can zip those things out of there pretty fast. These are all now lined up parallel. In other words, they're not twisted together like in a rope. They lay down next to each other in a parallel line, so that reduces the number of knots you get as you stitch, and it makes for very beautiful stitches because the threads are all parallel. They're not in a twisty ropes next to each other. So now that's how to strip threads. Now that you have them stripped, now it's time to put them in the needle. So some people do not use a needle threader, and honestly, they must be wizards because I don't know how to do that. I mean, I do, but it would drive me nuts. So the fastest way for me to get these strands into this needle is to use a needle threader. So I mentioned this one earlier. This one is very inexpensive, probably very common. You can find these at fabric stores and quilt stores. This is a little bit thicker one, but this one works just fine. You have to be a little gentle with it. So I'm going to put that needle threader through the hole in the needle. Now I'm going to feed the 3 strands, or however many strands you're using, through that loop like that. Now I'm going to hold my needle, and here's where you have to be gentle with your needle threader. You can just yank it through. You can just pull on this metal part and yank it, zip it through, and that'll get your threads through. It's a little hard on this thing because this is a very delicate wire. So instead of just holding onto the metal part and yanking it through, I actually pinch my fingers down on the wire itself. So I'm not putting stress on that spot where the little delicate wire is sort of pinched into that little thin metal piece. So I hold my fingers right here. I've got that thread through the loop. And now if I just pull it through, see how easily that goes through there? And then I pull off the needle threader, and there's my thread ready to go. Super simple. These will last a lot longer. If you do just yank them through, this wire will break or it'll come out pretty soon. If you pinch it like this, I've gotten these to last for quite a bit of time actually. So there's how to use a needle threader. The next thing is, how do you get the thread to stay in the fabric? Not everybody is a knotter, but I like to knot the ends of my thread. Some people are very against knots, but I like them, works for me. So here's what you do. I used to use the type of knot where you would go like this and then roll it off your finger, but if your hands are dry, your fingers are dry, that's a little bit tricky actually. So I use what's called a quilter's knot. Here's my threaded needle right here. I'm going to lay the ends. This is the other end of the thread. Hopefully you can see this. I'm going to pull it down so I have a little bit. I'm holding it between my thumb and finger, and I'm going to wrap this maybe twice. I'm going to transfer it to that hand, and then I'm very loosely pinching it with these two fingers, and then I'm going to very gently pull it through. And you can see I have a knot. Then I will trim, get my little scissors. I'm going to trim it, pull that knot so it's pretty tight. I'm going to trim it very close to the knot. And now I have a nice little knot that will stay in the fabric when I pull my first stitch through. So let me show you that one more time. Let me trim that knot off and I'll show you how to make, one more time, how to make the knot. I have my threaded needle. I lay the thread across the needle like this, and I hold it with that finger. Oh, sorry, hang on, let me do this again. All right, I take my thread, I lay it across the needle, on top of the needle, hold it with that hand, wrap it once or twice, then I'm going to hold it loosely in that hand, and then pull that thread through so that I end up with a little knot. Trim off the tails so they don't get pulled up in my work as I'm stitching. And there you go. All right, that is how to strip threads and tie a knot in your needle, in your thread. The first stitch we're going to learn is the back stitch, and it is probably the most common stitch in embroidery. It's really practical. I use it all the time. It's great for lines or curves, anywhere you just need a nice simple line. So to make the back stitch, we are going to come up on our line and make one stitch. Now the next stitch, you're going to come ahead on the line and now work back. Put the needle in right at the end of the previous stitch. Move the same stitch length ahead on the line and work back and put the needle down at the end of the previous stitch. So it's easy to see why this is called the back stitch. Makes a very nice, simple line, really easy to do, and you can do an entire pattern in back stitch. In fact, I designed one that it was all back stitch, and it looks great, easy to do, a lot of fun. So let me get to the end of this line, and the next stitch that we're going to do is called the split back stitch. So in order to do that, you have to know how to do the back stitch first. So there's the back stitch. Now we're going to do what's called the split back stitch, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Come up on the line, make a stitch, come ahead a stitch length, and now this time, instead of going back down right at the end of that stitch, I'm going to put my needle down into the stitch that we just made. In other words, I'm going to split that stitch and work my way across and do that exact same thing for every stitch. Split the one previous to it. So obviously, again, that's why this is called the split back stitch. The advantage to this is that this is a wonderful, great straight line. It has a little bit of a dashed effect. And this one has a little bit more of a solid line effect. It looks like little interlocking loops. And it's great for curves, stems. It looks good when you use more. I'm using 3 strands here. It looks really good if you use even more strands because it's a little bit more defined. But you can see now the difference between the regular back stitch and the split back stitch. So really simple, very versatile. Sort of you can use these interchangeably, but those are both great basic stitches to know. Remember when I said that you could use the back stitch or the split back stitch for an entire pattern? Well, that's exactly how I've done the first version of this rose. This is all the same stitch, that simple split back stitch, just using different colors. I used 6 strands of floss for the entire thing using this split back stitch. See if I can bring it up and you can see it a little bit more closely. And you can see it's really simple, and the interest in this comes from the different colors you use, but it's just one stitch for the entire thing. And it gives it a nice textured line, a little bit of that looped feeling. So really simple, really easy, a fun way to do a quick design. Really shows off nicely. And that's the split back stitch, the first version of this rose. The next stitch we're going to learn is called the chain stitch. And I think when you see it, you'll understand where it gets its name. It's very obvious. It looks like a chain. And there are 2 ways to do the chain stitch, the traditional way and the what's called reverse chain stitch. So first of all, let's talk about the traditional way. Bring your thread up. You're going to go back down exactly where you came up. And so now you have this loop created. Come up on the line, a stitch length ahead, but come up through that loop that you create with the thread. So don't pull it all the way through first, and then when you pull it, you'll create a little link in the chain. Same thing, you've come up here, go back down right where your thread came out. Now you have this loop. Come up a stitch length ahead and pull, so you have another loop. So you're going to keep doing that all the way across or around. Come up between your loop and work all of these loops until your line is complete. So that's the traditional way. Let me work across here. This stitch works well on curves. If you're working on curves, it's best to have your stitches be a little bit shorter so that the short stitches can fit around the curves the best. But you can make the stitches whatever length you want. They'll just have a little bit slightly different look. So that's the traditional way. To end the chain stitch, when you come to the end of the line, you've come up inside the loop, take your needle and go down outside so that you hook the end of that loop like that. So that's the traditional chain stitch. Now let's do the reverse chain stitch. First thing you're going to want to do is make a little tiny stitch like that. All right, now come up a stitch length ahead, come all the way through, and now you're going to run the needle under that stitch. Pull it, don't pull it so tightly that the thread is just choked up in there, and go back down. That's the first one. Now you do the same thing, but you're going to run your needle under the loop and go right back down where it came up. Move a stitch length ahead. Go under the loop. You're not going into the fabric, you're running the needle under the loop like that. So just as before, you can vary the length of these stitches, long or short, but if you're working on curves, make them a little bit smaller. And they'll just look different depending on how long or short they are. But it does work well for curves. This is a great stitch if you're doing lettering or just line work, and you want a little bit more of a texture than you got with the split back stitch. And in just a minute, when I show you the another version of the rose, we will use both of these chain stitches, the traditional and the reverse, as a filling stitch, and I'll show you that in just a moment. So now that I'm at the end of this line, you can see how this one, still using 3 strands of thread, but it has both of these use 3 strands, the back stitch, the split back stitch, the traditional chain, and the reverse chain, but you can see how thin this one looks, and this one has a little bit more texture to it. So that's the chain stitch. Really fun stitch, wonderful again for lines or curves, and a lot of uses. Some people prefer the traditional, some people only prefer the reverse, but here in just a little bit I'm going to show you where we're going to use both of those together. The next version of this rose is going to use the chain stitch, and I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm going to hand hold this, so it's going to be a little shaky. I can't really put it in the stand that I normally use when I video because I like to move the hoop around as I stitch this chain stitch. So, and that's just impossible to do when it's in the stand. So it's going to be a little bit shaky. I'm going to try to hold it as steady as possible. So anyway, sorry, it's going to be a little bit wobbly. So, and remember I showed you 2 different versions of the chain stitch, the traditional and the reverse. So the chain stitch is great for lines, but it's also wonderful for filling, as a filling stitch. So that's what I'm doing here. You can see I've done these already. There, you can see it. Done these. This one, this petal, I used it as an outline, and then I just put some straight stitches in between. I think I'm going to have a couple of petals every once in a while that just have these lines in it, so I don't have to fill every single petal with the chain stitch. But to show you how to fill, the first thing I'm doing is I'm starting on the outside line with the traditional chain stitch. Drop my needle. Hang on, let me get a hold of it again. Sorry about that. Okay. And I will finish out this line. So as I mentioned before, I go up, go back down in the place where I came up, then come up through the loop and pull that loop. And this is where I rotate my hoop as I go around. Back down through the loop. Come up through the loop I form, pull that one close to the fabric. And what I'm doing here every time is I'm holding this thread with my thumb so it keeps it out of the way so I can see what I'm doing, which is another reason I like to hand hold it. So now I'm at the end of this line, and that's my last stitch, and I'm going to finish that stitch off by anchoring it just like that. So now I could continue. The way I'm going to fill it is I'm going to do this line, and I'm going to do a line that goes back the other direction that snugs up right against the line I just did. So now I'll go back this direction and just keep doing these concentric lines back and forth until you fill in the whole shape. So if I were to start this line and work back this way with the traditional chain stitch, the loops would be headed the other direction. Right now the top of the loop goes that direction. And if I continued with the same exact traditional chain stitch and went this direction, the loops would go the other way. And so it's a little kind of confusing to have loops and concentric lines all going these different directions. So in order to combat that, I think I'm going to keep it that way again, I'm going to now switch to the reverse chain stitch. So when we did that, we made a little tiny first stitch, just a little bitty straight stitch like that. Don't pull it too tightly. And now I'm going to jump ahead 1 stitch length and run under that little straight stitch that we made. And go back down. And that's our first loop. Come a stitch length away, run the needle under that first loop that we made, and go back down. So this way, all of the loops will continue to face the top. The rounded part of the loop will all be that direction as the lines go around. Now I think I've decided, working on my other petals, that it's really a little bit easier if I work going this direction, because, see, can you see? Okay, when I jump ahead to the next stitch, the trickiest part doing the reverse chain stitch is that I'm having to put the needle under this loop, and there's a line of stitching right next to it. So I kind of have to I don't want to go under all of those stitches. I only want to go under the loop that I just made. So what I'm doing is I'm pushing with my left finger. I'm not sure if you see on the back, I'm pushing up like that. So I'm kind of pushing the fabric up and just trying to get under just that one loop that the last loop that I made on the reverse chain stitch. But other than that, it's really very simple. You just make rings, lines, you know, circular lines that are all right next to each other until you fill in the whole shape. So I'll do a little bit of this and I'll speed it up so you can see what the stitching looks like. So now that I'm at the end of that row of reverse chain stitch, I'm going to switch back again to the traditional chain stitch and just work my way back around. This time, hold that thread out of the way and do the same thing as I did on the first row with this line of stitches right up against the second line that I just completed. So that's all there is to it for this. Well, this is the classic, but wait, there's more section. I did want to point out on the chain stitch filling that I'm using. I know I had talked about how one row is traditional, the next row is reverse, then traditional, then reverse, and that's what I've been doing up until here. But you know, right here, it's getting really tiny, really tight. So I just finished this row. This last row was traditional chain stitch. But I don't really want to have to, you know, try to figure out how to get my needle under those little tiny stitches in that little tiny space. So I finished over here. This is where I just finished the last line. Instead of trying to switch to reverse, I am just going to finish out this little section all in traditional. So even though I just put my needle down right there, I'm going to come across. I'm going to just bring my thread over underneath and come up over here like this, and just do another row of traditional chain stitch. Traditional chain stitch in this little tiny area is easier because you're not trying to put your needle under a little loop of thread from side to side. You're just going up and down like that. So it's really easier in a little tiny space like this to do the traditional chain stitch. And I'll just use, I'm almost through with this row. Let me do one more little tiny stitch right there. I'll lock that one down And then it looks like there's maybe room for one single stitch right there. Just like that. And then lock that one down. And now that section is finished. So I just wanted you to know that although when you've got big long areas that it's easy to get the needle underneath, you can switch from traditional and then the next row reverse and then traditional and reverse. But in these small areas, it doesn't hurt to just drag your thread back across on the back side and just come back across and keep doing. You could do traditional, another row of traditional, another row of traditional, as long as you start in the same place so that the stitches are all facing the same direction. So there you go. That section's finished. I'll keep working on the rest. Well, I am finished stitching this version of the rows, and I wanted to let you know what I ended up doing about the traditional chain stitch versus the reverse chain stitch. The more I stitched it, the more I realized that it was just not, A, it just wasn't fun, and B, it was a little tricky to try to switch back and forth and get the needle under, for the reverse chain stitch, to get it under the loops when you're working right up next to another row of stitching. So I ended up doing each row in traditional chain stitch. So what I did was, for instance, I would start, for any one of these, I would start over here, work my way over to here, tie a knot, clip the thread, tie another knot in the end of my thread, start back over here, work my way across, end my thread, start back over here, work around. As I got a little closer in, I would just carry the thread across the back and just go back and forth. But when these long stretches, I did each row as a separate row and started over each time. And I just liked the way the stitches all looked the same because it was the same type of chain stitch, the traditional. And I really just enjoyed it more. Now you can try it both ways. You may like the reverse chain stitch more, and you might do every row in reverse. You might like switching back and forth. If so, that's great. Do whatever is the most enjoyable for you. I also wanted to talk to you about the leaves. Obviously on these I did the lines, but on the ones where I filled in the solid parts, very similar to over here, but I went in just concentric lines. I just went around. I started on the outside edge, went around, down, and just kept working, spiraling my way in until I got to the very center and finished off like that. So I really enjoyed stitching this one. Obviously, it's not the hardest. It's not that it's difficult. There's just a lot of stitching. There's a lot of thread on the hoop. So while it's not difficult, it takes a little more time, but I really enjoyed the effect that I got, and I had a really good time stitching it, and I hope you do too. The third stitch we're going to learn is called well, it kind of has several names. It's the blanket stitch, the buttonhole stitch. Sometimes it's called the pinwheel stitch, depending on how you use it. But it is, the best way I can do it is just to show you. So I'm going to start at the top here, come out. I'm going to hold this thread up, and I'm not going to come straight down. I'm going to jog over just a little bit, go down, hold a loop, and then come up inside that loop, pull that thread, and then you see how it makes like a little jog over, like a little L. Same thing. So now I've come up, I'm going to come over here, go down, hold the loop, come up inside that loop, and pull the thread. Now a lot of this stitch has to do with the tension of the thread when you pull it and the direction you pull it. So now that I'm ready to pull this thread, I'm going to pull it. I don't want to pull it this way because it won't form the stitch correctly. I'm going to pull it in the direction, I'm working this direction, so I'm going to pull the thread that direction, and it kind of makes that stitch lay down. If I pull it too tight, it will make that stitch funky. It won't look right. So if I'm going to pull it sort of straight across, and that will give you this nice sort of folded looking edge on the top. So I will continue this on these parallel lines, but in the flower, the rose that we're working on, we're actually not doing parallel, a straight line. We are doing curved lines. Got a little wonky there, but that's okay. Let me finish this out so you can see me do it a couple more times. Pull that thread straight across. And do one more. Pull that thread. All right, to finish, you can put one little locking stitch right there. But like I said, we're not working in a straight line across. We're working in an arc like this. So this is where I might call this stitch the pinwheel stitch. But what it's going to do is it's going to have radiating, instead of these being straight up and down or parallel, they're going to sort of radiate out like this. And in fact, if you want to draw your stitches, if you want to mark them on each petal as you go across, that's perfectly fine. In fact, that's really helpful sometimes, because you can see over here I wasn't quite paying attention and they got a little uneven. So same thing, start at the outside edge where you want to have your pinwheel. Come down to the inside edge, but hold that loop open. Come back to the outside edge, and now pull that stitch. We're going this direction, so pull it up like that and find the tension that forms that stitch right where you want it to be. Now come back down to the inside, hold the loop open, go back to the outside edge and pull that stitch across. Back down to the inside, hold the loop, come up on the outside, hold that. Now, when I'm doing these stitches on the rose, actually, I think I'm going to make them closer together. So instead of having them be spaced quite so far apart, I will do them more like this close, maybe. It depends. It's a different look. Both of them are correct. So now I'll do these stitches very close together. Whoops, almost did that right. Wrong. I came up here, I'm gonna go down on the inside circle and up on the outside edge. Down on the inside, hold the loop. Hopefully I'm not covering up what I'm doing here. So you can see when you start to place these closer together, it looks a little bit different. It's a different look. You can do them really closely together and it almost looks like satin stitch with a little decorative edge on it. So this is another stitch that's very versatile, depending on, has different looks depending on how you do it. So you can see how those stitches still radiate out like that. And here's where you can see why sometimes it's called the pinwheel stitch if it's in a circular design. Whoops, hold that loop. Remember, I'm always pulling this thread and paying attention. I'm pulling that thread in the direction I'm going and I'm paying attention to how tight that stitch is. So just a couple more stitches and I will be at the end of this petal. And then I'll just put one little stitch over that last part at the top to lock it in place. And there you go. That is the blanket stitch, buttonhole stitch, buttonhole wheel, or pinwheel. This version of the flower uses the stitch of many names. I mentioned that it's sometimes called the buttonhole stitch, the blanket stitch, or the pinwheel stitch. I've also heard it called the buttonhole blanket wheel, I think is what it's been called also. But it kind of depends on if you're doing it in a straight line, it might be called a buttonhole stitch or a blanket stitch. If it's in an arc or a circle, if you complete the whole circle, it might be called a pinwheel or the blanket wheel or buttonhole wheel. I just tend to call it the pinwheel. So here it is. We're going to start, and you can see I'm working from the center out of the flower. For the center little green section, I didn't want to do the pinwheel on that circle. It's so tiny. So I just did the split back stitch. But all of the rest of these are the pinwheel stitch. And you're going to start right over where the line touches the other pinwheels, the other petals, and come up. You're going to hold that thread out of the way, go down just a little bit, and then hold that loop, come up inside that loop. And here's the part that you have to kind of pay attention to is the direction that you're pulling this thread. I'm going to pull it up or a little bit to the right, but I'm going to pull up. So I'll show you that again. I'm going to hold this thread out of the way. Usually if I'm hand holding a hoop, I'll just hold that with my thumb. Oh, I did it wrong. I do that all the time with this stitch. I'm supposed to go down and I come up from the back. So let me fix that quickly. Yeah, it's a common problem, common mistake I make if I'm not quite thinking about it. So let me quickly see if I can quickly rethread my needle. Okay, there we go. Let's start over. So I have come up. I'm going to go down from the front. There's that loop. Come up on the outside edge of the petal and pull through and pull the thread up. And I'm going to do a few more of these stitches and talk to you about the tension. Get right on that line. So, a couple of things. If you want to, it is perfectly fine if you wanted to mark the lines that you're going to follow so that you're not just sort of eyeing it or winging it as you go along. So you could make some radiating lines like this, which is perfectly fine. The other thing is, as I mentioned, the tension. So when I'm going to hold that one out of the way, go down, come up on the outside edge. And the reason it's important to pull this in the right direction, if I was pulling down like this, see how this top thread is angling that way? Well, it's not going to stay in a straight line. See how all these run straight across the top? This wouldn't hold that outside line as well. If I pull it up, it's going to stay in place. And if I leave it too loose, it's going to be sort of curved. If I pull it too tight, it's going to push down. It's not going to form that nice line around the edge, the outside edge. So let me just show you a few more of these stitches. And I will speed the rest of this petal up, and then I'll talk to you about how to finish it at the very end. Okay, now I'm at the very end, and it's really simple. I've made this is a little short stitch right here, just from there to there, and now all I really have to do is I've come up and then just go straight down, and that will finish out that line. The only other thing to remember when you're doing this stitch is that because these stitches are in an arc or an array, the stitches on the inside, the ones closest to the center, are going to be closer together than the space between the stitches at the top. And it's most noticeable, for instance, on this petal right here. You can see how the stitches along here are really just packed closely together, and then they're spaced out maybe 1/8 of an inch along this outside edge. And it just depends on the size of the petal, how close together, like you can see here, the inside, the center section of the petal where the stitches are down here by the closest to the center, they're further apart than they are on this one, but it still holds true that they're closer on this side edge than they are on this edge. So I love this stitch. It works up really fast. You can see how pretty it is. It's a really neat effect, and I hope you enjoy stitching this version of the flower. The last thing I want to show you is how to finish the back of your hoop. So there's the front. I have taken it out of the hoop that was wrapped so that I can use that one again for a different hoop if I want to. So this is the one that's going to be hung on the wall or displayed. So it's just in a regular hoop that doesn't have the inside wrap. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew a running stitch all the way around the edge of this excess fabric. So to do that, I just have one of my lengths of thread left over. Make sure that it's long enough to go all the way around around the hoop. And I'm going to tie a knot just like I did before, but I'm going to leave myself a really long tail of thread. And I'll show you why I'm going to do that in just a minute. So I'm going to make a knot the same way I did before, but see how I'm leaving a really long tail right there? And I'm going to wrap it 3 times because I want a pretty big knot, because it's going to be tied pretty tightly. I mean, it's going to be pulled on. So there is my rather large knot with a tail. So a running stitch is really simple. You just go in and out of the fabric like that and go all the way around. I will see if I can, let me do that so you can see what I'm doing a little bit more. So see how I'm just going up and down, in and out, and then pulling, and I'll just go around the entire edge of that excess fabric. And I'll do that. I'll speed it up so you can see me do the whole thing. Okay, so now I have used the running stitch all the way around the edge, and this is where that big knot and that tail is going to come in handy. So now I'm just going to pull on this part. See how it tightens that up? Tug on it pretty tightly. That's why you want a big knot so it doesn't rip itself through the fabric. And then here's where the tail comes in handy. I'm going to tie this very tightly to hold that in place. Just tie a double knot. And then trim those off like that. And so that's the first part. Now, I like to, you can cover this with a piece of like heavyweight cardstock, scrapbook paper, a decorative scrap paper if you want. I like to use felt. This is it's like craft felt. It's called premium felt at Joann's. It's kind of thick. It's got a nice feel, but it's not the expensive wool felt. So what I did with that is I laid my hoop down on the felt, traced around it with my disappearing marker, and then I cut just inside that line so that when I put it on the back here, it's just inside the hoop itself. In other words, I don't want it to hang over this edge. So now that fits just right. And now what I'm going to do is, hang on, let me get, you can glue this, you can hot glue this around the edge if you want. That's nice and quick. You can also sew it. So here's another piece. You can use one of your leftover colors or white if you have it. You can use sewing thread. You don't have to use embroidery floss for this. But if you're going to sew it, I have a knot in the end of this, and I'm going to run it under this fabric like that, and then get it in place and come up through the felt. And then now I can just go around. I'm going to get a little bit, if you can see what I'm doing. I'm catching a little bit of the fabric and then coming up through the felt. Come on. And pulling it through. And I will just continue all the way around, grab a little bit of fabric up through the felt until I have gone all the way around. And so you have a nice little, it's called a whip stitch actually, but just sew that all the way around. And so now you've got the back covered up and it keeps out dust. So that is how to finish off your embroidery hoop.